Everyone. So I start out the second week of class, or the opening week of class, with chapter 8, which is kind of weird because I should be opening up with chapter 1 of the Texas politics book. But chapter 8 I find much more important because it sets the foundation for understanding the larger public opinion and media and how it plays out in Texas politics and history. So that's why I start with a few chapters in of the textbook on the first week of classes. Next week we start chapter 1, and then you'll understand the basic foundation of the history once you understand how the media shapes the history of politics. So for the learning objectives of this chapter, I want you to understand the role of public opinion in the U.S. and Texas politics, explain the function of medias in U.S. and Texas politics, describe the various sources of media in Texas, explain the role of media in Texas politics campaigns, the biases in the Texas media, how it's regulated, and concerns of control of the media. So let's begin by establishing a basic understanding of what is public opinion. The role of the public in political decision-making has transformed over time. It's changed. A public is self-aware, interactive, and engaged. The public sphere is a community's arena that allows individuals to freely discuss and identify societal problems and influence political action. Now, political communication is concerned with the social and political matters between and among citizens, the media, and the governing elite. It's our everyday discussion. Public opinion can mean a number of things, depending on who is discussing it, who is trying to measure it, and for what purpose it's being used. Public opinions are formed through political socializations, that is, the learning of political attitudes and opinions through agents of socialization. Well, what do I mean by agents of socialization? I'm talking about family, education, religious institutional, general effects, or generational effects, I should say, and the media. This is where you and I interact every day, okay? That's how we get our social understanding of how the world operates. In Texas, the individualistic and traditionalistic political culture, the Republican government, and conservative media affect individual public opinion. So how can it be measured? Public opinion is measured formally through voting and informally through public opinion polls and the mass media. For example, straw polls. This is an unofficial personal interviews surrounding a formal vote. These emerged in the 1800s. Since then, polling has become more scientific and now uses statistically methodological routes such as a probability sampling. Today, scientific methods such as public opinion surveys and focus groups are much more common. Much of measuring public opinion depends on who is doing the polling and the techniques they choose. Less scientific methods are still in use, including both the straw poll and exit polls. These are interviews with citizens right after they voted. You have to remember that when you look at exit polls, you have to look at who publishes the exit poll. Now, if, for example, I'm being hired to conduct an exit poll of a local election, and it's being asked of me by a particular news organization. Well, as an employee of the news organization, I'm going to ask, hey, what is it that you're looking at? What is it that you want me to find out? So when they tell me what they want to know, I'm going to cater my questions to get that particular answer. So is it scientific? Maybe so, maybe not. My response would be that it is not, because as the interviewer or the scientific method that I'm employing, I'm sort of leading the voter or the interviewee to give me a certain answer that appeals to my employer. Okay, so that's why you can't really believe in exit polls that are published by news media sources, okay, because you always have to ask who is providing the paycheck for these exit polls to be conducted. One method that is considered outright illegitimate is the push poll, in which opposing candidates and ideas are attacked during the interview. Push polls are specifically used to mobilize public opinion in the guise of gathering data. The media and their function. Freedom of speech was intended not just for newsmongers, but for everyone. All should be allowed to give their opinion. Freedom of the press meant freedom to use printing technology, the print medium. No one opinion should have more access than any other. Over time, the meanings of the press and the media have been broadened to come to overlap. So what are the media? In a basic sense, the media are a set of technological mediums, but in modern terms, the media means much more. Political scientist Harold Laswell, who says what, in which channel, to win, with whom effect. Now that's kind of a play on his original definition. His original definition doesn't say who says what in which channel to come to which effect. It's a play on his original definition, keep in mind, please. So the media comprises a complex system of messaging by private companies, journalists, citizens, and public institutions motivated by economic, ideological, or professional interests. Mass media transmits information to mass audience. What are the media? Media as sources of information. The media provide information, coverage of the ongoings in the community. The news is the stories that provide timely information about important events or individuals in the community, state, nation, or the world. Hard news covers important events involving elected leaders, major issues, or scientific disruptions. Soft news, such as human interest stories, aim to entertain. Soft news can take the negative tone of critical journalism, focusing on political scandal, vice, or mistakes of the government and politicians. How media shapes perceptions. Regardless of intent, whether a story appears and remains in the headlines influences public opinion. Now, it's often been said in psychological studies of the media that it takes 5 seconds for anything that you see or hear to be embedded in your memory. So 5 seconds is a relative base time, and it's a very important and critical time in formulating public opinion. Gatekeeping determines newsworthiness. Agenda setting is deciding what is news, the power to bring issues and problems to the public attention. And we see that all the time, right? When you watch television news, or you look at newspapers and news medias or online internet sources, they tell you what's the most important topics of the day. And sometimes you're wondering, why is this news, right? So priming involves the ability to shape public opinion, respecting an event or a person in this public sphere. The media also frames issues for us. That is, it places them within a particular context or perspective to shape public perception. Resonance. It refers to the reinforcement and magnification of existing beliefs about events due to how they are presented in the media. Media as linkage institutions and political actors. The mass media traditionally acts as a conduit for information, both up and down, between the political elite and their constituents. As political actors, the mass media are the reporters of objective fact, neutral advisories or watchdogs, public advocates, profit seekers, and propagandas. It depends on your opinion, of course. Media sources: print, broadcast, and online. The media are typically categorized by the type of messaging and the type of medium. Print media typically includes newspapers and magazines. I don't know how many of us still read print media. And anyway, electronic media includes both broadcast, television and radio, and the internet and social media. Where broadcast media function as one-to-many transmissions, digital content is often many-to-many. Each medium contains with it the medium that came before it. Newspapers and magazines. Americans once relied on the print media for information about their local communities, politics, war, and domestic and international events. Newspapers also play the role of public watchdog. Competition came from radio in the 1920s and then television in the 1950s. Many Americans still rely on print media for news. Magazines are far fewer in number than newspapers. News magazines typically offer more in-depth coverage using investigative style journalism, deeply researched stories. How many of you actually read magazines, newspapers, that sort of thing? The top 10 newspapers in Texas and daily circulation: Houston Chronicle, Dallas Morning News, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, San Antonio Express News, Austin American Statesman, the Daily Focus News, Corpus Christi Caller Times, Waco Tribune, El Paso Times, El Diario de El Paso. All of these are perhaps the most important newspapers if you want major news sources from Texas. These are the sources you go to. And of course, this graph shows you the circulation of U.S. daily newspapers. You see that in 1940, it was gaining its prominence. In the 1980s or 1970s, when we had a lot of international politics occurring in our history, it was pretty high in terms of circulation. And of course, going into 2018 and to now, we find that hard copy of newspapers is relatively low. The internet and social media networks. With the internet, citizens can now interact with live events, becoming part of the news as it happens. Users often self-select information consistent with their existing beliefs, leaving little room for dissent. Social media and cell phones have also become important for information gathering, leading to the emergence of citizen journalism. Social media sites often spread news of stories the traditional news media sources don't cover. False information can also be spread more easily, claiming to be news based upon fact. The internet and social media networks. Social media can complement traditional media as individuals share information from television, radio, and newspapers via their personal networks. Another medium by which citizens obtain information is the podcast, a digital audio file made available on the internet for downloading, often available as part of a series. More of a threat to traditional media's longevity are streaming services that transfer music or voting data over the internet, usually by subscription. The internet and social media networks. One of the more recent examples of how social media moved to the public occurred in the mid-summer of 2016 after Brexit voted in Britain to leave the European Union. Twitter feeds list up with calls for #Texit, which would allow for a referendum for Texas to secede from the United States. A referendum, keep in mind, is a direct public vote on a single political issue. Digital campaigning and citizen participation. For some individuals, online communities have increased exposure to political issues and events, which has increased users' political participation. The internet also allows campaigns to connect directly with the public without the interference or interpretation of the traditional media. Candidates who fail to utilize the power of social media do so at their own peril. But remember, the internet doesn't forget inappropriate or ill-timed statements. Media bias and perceptions of media bias. Media bias refers to the actual or perceived failure of the media to report news objectively. Selection bias involves the systemic selection of particular news that presents a distorted view, reflecting partisan ideological positions on the issue. Presentation bias involves the tone of a story reflecting a significantly distorted view, such as favoring one political party over another. There is no firm evidence that partisan media are making ordinary Americans more partisan. The reality of media bias. Media bias plays a large role in public opinion by reinforcing political beliefs. Journalists perceive themselves as being more liberal than both the owners of the media and the public in general. Bias can also result from journalistic norms. Citizens increasingly self-select news sources that match their ideological biases and reject other sources, contributing to the growing ideological gap among citizens. There are, however, legal limits on what is considered reasonable political communication. Regulating the media. Federal regulation of print and broadcast media. While print media are largely unregulated, broadcast media work under certain constraints. The laws prohibit the publishing of libelous information. The Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, issues regulations regarding broadcasting media. Media outlets have little control over the content of the political ads, especially those placed by super PACs. Groups can also use newspapers and TV news stories without permission as part of the fair use in ways that distort the original intent. There are some rules that affect how the media treat political candidates and campaigns. The equal time rule. This requires broadcasters to provide equal air time to opposing views. The right of rebuttal. This gives candidates the opportunity to respond to criticism. The FCC has been criticized for being lax in its enforcement. The FCC would argue that the growth of less regulated information sources, such as the Internet, allows for a sufficient number of alternative views. The Internet remains largely unregulated. Network or net neutrality is the principle that Internet service providers should enable access to all content and applications regardless of the source. The FCC has sought to protect net neutrality in the courts. In 2017, however, some protections of net neutrality were ended. The Internet presents something of a conundrum for policymakers in terms of how to access obscene material on the Internet. The Child Internet Protection Act requires federally funded schools and public libraries to prevent minors from gaining access to certain materials. Many Internet service providers require users to agree to terms of service that include general and specific prohibitions. State and local regulation. States use their police powers to regulate aspects of the Internet. In 2009, the Texas legislature amended the penal code to prohibit criminal harassment through electronic means. State and local agencies are working to create their own internal rules for connecting with communities via social media. In the past few years, more police departments have been using social media to help find criminals and provide community updates. Public opinion is the sum of attitudes and opinions of individuals and groups on a particular topic. When conflict arises, public opinion can help determine policy. The media help shape public opinion, and they have changed how political campaigns and politicians connect citizens and voters. The media can regulate, but there are limitations on what the government can prohibit or limit. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thanks for listening.